Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Bustamante, and this video is about 8.7, which is disruptions to ecosystems. So there are going to be lots of ways that you can disrupt an ecosystem. We're really going to talk about 3 of them here in this video and what are some of the effects of them. So I just want to take us back a little bit. Remember evolution, right? Remember that ecosystems are always changing. Remember that it's based on the energy available and that they have to kind of react, or they do react, we can sort of see based on things that are happening around them in an ecosystem. And also remember, we've talked a lot about diversity and biodiversity being important. Remember that diversity helps in stability of an ecosystem, and it's really determined by the variation that is present in that particular ecosystem. Different organisms, right, have different adaptations that are beneficial to their survival in a given environment. And remember that adaptation is beneficial if it is selected upon based on what's happening in the environment, right? So we could have like a desert environment or more of a forest environment or even like a coral reef, right? We're not necessarily going to find the same types of organisms there because they all have different traits or adaptations that help them survive in that given situation where they wouldn't be able to in other situations. So remember, when we're talking about disrupting ecosystems here, we want diversity that helps make a stable ecosystem. In fact, if that ecosystem gets disrupted, right, if it's more diverse, it has an easier time, if you will, recovering and getting back to normal or more diverse again, too. Something to remember about our traits, right, when we talk about these adaptations are really just traits and they arise through mutations, right? Mutations are random, they're not directional, they're not specific to some sort of environmental pressure, right? They don't come about because an animal or an organism needs an adaptation. They just happen to be there and they get selected for or selected against based on if they are helpful in survival, right, under those given conditions. We see a trait increase in frequency if the environment continues to select for that trait, right, if it is beneficial. And remember, we go DNA, RNA, protein, and that produces our phenotypes, our traits that we're talking about, right? And this frequency of increasing traits, right, that are beneficial can increase biodiversity. It helps populations evolve. Remember, populations, not individuals. And it can cause speciation to occur too, right? The development of new species over time. So as an ecosystem, though, gets disrupted, different traits can be selected for because the ecosystem changes, right? And now different traits may or may not be beneficial. We're going to talk about 3 ways you can disrupt an ecosystem. We're going to talk about invasive species, some human activities, and geological and meteorological activities or events that happen. Now, we're going to talk about all 3 of these very, very briefly. We could spend lots of time on them. And also remember, this isn't like the only 3 ways that you can disrupt an ecosystem. There are actually lots of ways in which you can disrupt your ecosystem. We're just going to kind of focus on these 3 for today. So the first one is invasive species. Invasive species is one that is not, we say, native to a specific area, meaning somehow it has been transported kind of into that area either on purpose or by accident, but it isn't found there sort of naturally, you can say. We can say that's intentionally or unintentionally brought into an area. And typically what happens when you have this invasive species is it exploits new niches, right? So it can find a niche where there's kind of an open space, if you will, right? A free niche of predators or competitors, and it can fill that space. But it can also outcompete native species, right? So sometimes it can actually be more fit for a given environment, and we can see it take over native species or species that should be there, you could say, because it can outcompete them. So invasive species increase in population size of that invasive species if there's nothing else there to check them, right? To be their predator, to help control their population. And a lot of times because they're not meant to be there, the ecosystem isn't really set up to have, say, a predator or something that checks their population for them. So we're going to look at some examples here. The first one is something called kudzu. I think that's how you say it. And it's a vine. It looks just like that, like a vine, kind of like ivy or something like that. And sometimes it's referred to as the vine that ate the South. It's actually native to Japan and Southeast Asia. But in 1930 to 1950, we started bringing it over, and it got kind of promoted as a way to combat soil erosion. And so we brought it to the South, basically to try and keep the land where it is. Well, what happens, right, is it grows really, really fast. When it's mature, it can grow up to 1 foot per day on mature vines, and it can grow as long as 100 feet. So it grows fast, and it can really take over. And what happened is it ended up overtaking native plants, native grasses and trees, which, remember, like, everything is interconnected, right? So when we lose those plants, those trees, when they're competing for resources, we're also going to lose other plants, animals, insects in the area. So that's just one example, and you can see here, I think this is like a hill in Tennessee, and it covered the whole hill, everything that was there, totally covered in this plant. Another example of an invasive species is zebra mussels. They're small freshwater shellfish that were likely brought to the US kind of on stowaways on ships. They're native to the Caspian and Black Seas of the South Russia and Ukraine. Here's what they look like, right? And now they're pretty widespread in both Europe and the US. They actually kind of started in the Great Lakes. Now we see them on the northwest coast, so you might even see them in our area, if you will. And what do? They prevent native mussels from moving, feeding, reproducing, regulating, right? So the water properly, so they really can't do their job. The native species, these take over, right, which is going to have an effect on other species within the environment too. Basically, they outcompete natives for food and space, and they can reproduce quickly, so they kind of take over. Why are they called zebra mussels? Well, if you look at them, they have kind of this striped pattern, right? They look sort of like a zebra on a shell. So human activities also really affect ecosystems. As humans use more land and we use more resources, right, we're going to influence and change local and global ecosystems. There are lots of ways we can do this. Here's just a couple. Through urbanization, right, as we move to cities, as we expand our urban areas, right, we take up more land. We move out from rural areas into more densely populated areas, right? This is going to affect the land. We're going to change the environment and change the ecosystem all over in that space, right? Deforestation, as we use trees to build things, right? We often end up with big deforested areas, which is going to affect that ecosystem as well, right? Through logging or other means to harvest that wood. Erosion, something we kind of sometimes don't think about. Erosion is where the land gets worn away, typically transported by natural forces such as wind and water and just natural events. But if we're starting to change the landscape in other ways, like deforesting it, right, logging it, cutting it down, or really just changing how it all connects, that sometimes can increase erosion as well in certain areas. And when we increase erosion, we're going to lose nutrients and plants that were in that area, have a big long-term effect. Pollution, of course, right? It's going to disturb and change our ecosystem in lots of different ways, depending on what that pollution is. Climate change, right? As we see climates change throughout the world, we know that the organisms that are there are adapted to live in a certain climate. So we're going to see those changes in climate affect the ecosystem, and that ecosystem pressure will be expressed through different organisms that are or are not adapted as that environment changes. And then monocropping. Monocropping is planting just a single type of crop over and over and over again year after year. And it can have some kind of harmful effects. Well, so why do we do it? You might ask. Well, if you're a farmer, you might know how to grow one thing really well. It might be adapted for your particular situation, right? But there are some problems with monocropping. One is going to use the same nutrients from your land kind of over and over again. So over time, your land becomes arid, doesn't have as much nutrients in it to grow things. Also, if you're thinking about monocropping and you have just one, say, genetic species that you grow over and over again, it's going to be really susceptible to if there's any sort of disease, right, you'll lose your entire crop because there's not that variety there, and that can be detrimental as well, but also detrimental to the land. So one kind of example to look at is the Irish potato famine. I know this was a very long time ago, in 1845 to 1851. So potato crops were actually domesticated for agricultural purposes, meaning like to sell them, to eat them, right, in South America. And then they got introduced into the Americas and Europe for trade practices. Well, they have actually a very common fungal species that can affect potatoes, and it did so in the mid-19th century, in this 1845 to 1851 period, right? So the South and Central American crops were affected, but not quite as much as the European crops, particularly Irish farmers relied greatly on potatoes to feed their families and their economic support. And they really didn't have a lot of extra that they could use to support things. It was kind of this hand-to-mouth sort of way of living, right? So their crops get contaminated and it really kind of destroys them. It's very destructive. It resulted in approximately 50% of all potato crops being non-usable, right? And so it leads to what we call the Great Famine, or the Irish potato famine, and it led to approximately 1 million deaths in that time, right? Because that crop became disease infected and it spread. Not great, right? So the last way we're going to talk about is geological or meteorological events. They can affect a habitat and ecosystem. What are these, right? Volcanoes, meteors, any kind of like big event, right? That is kind of uncontrolled as far as we know, right? What do they cause? Typically large habitat disruptions because it's a big area. Chemical disruptions, like how does the environment, the chemicals in the environment change? They can accelerate evolution because there's all of a sudden a big change. They can cause extinctions. And how do we kind of know this, right? Well, we've done biogeographical studies that illustrate these changes where they analyze species distribution, and then they kind of use them to characterize where the biomes of the world are at a given time, right? So what are some examples of this? Continental drift, right? You may have heard millions of years ago. We believe there was the single kind of continent called Pangaea, right? And over time, the tectonic plates have separated into our different continents. Big geological trade, or an asteroid, right? If an asteroid, say, hit the Earth, like we think possibly happened with the dinosaur extinction, right? This would allow new species to arise and those dinosaurs to go pretty much extinct, right? Actually cause some environmental changes as well. And so as we look through time through this, we see that mammals in particular start to evolve and exploit these new niches and now sort of turn into the world that we know now. I hope this video was helpful, and I'll see you soon.